Data from Stats South Africa shows that South Africa's unemployment rate decreased by 1 percentage point from 33.9% in the second quarter to 32.9% in the third quarter of 2022. But youth unemployment remains high. People between the ages of 15 and 34 remain vulnerable in the labour market. Their unemployment rate is 45.5%. The latest quarterly labour force survey indicates that the total number of persons employed was 15.8 million in the third quarter of 2022. The manufacturing, trade, construction and transport industries recorded the largest job gains, while job losses were recorded in finance, private households and mining and agriculture each. Sectors that recorded job increases were the formal and informal, with 235,000 and 6,000 jobs respectively. For more analysis on the numbers, we are joined by Xhanti Payi, who is an economist and head of research at Nascence Advisory. Xhanti, thank you so much for your time. Were you surprised by this particular figure that we got this quarter, or was it in line with your expectations?
I think, good afternoon. I think it is pleasantly surprising in terms of the kind of upside that we've seen. I think very few people would have thought, given some of the pressure that we've seen, especially that we would see this kind of uptick in the manufacturing sector. There are some sectors that have been under pressure, but certainly in the manufacturing sector isn't one where I would have thought that or would have seen it as the kind of growth that it has seen. Remember, manufacturing very largely depends on electricity or energy sources. We know there's also been this kind of interest rate environment. So this has been surprising on the upside. I think it's a very, very good thing. But of course, I think, as we've mentioned, there are a number of other difficult situations that we've seen as well.
We'll get to that, but outside of manufacturing, and you're seeing that one of the drivers there also been trade, construction and transport sectors. I mean, given the performance in those sectors, do then the numbers make sense?
Yes, look, I think that we are still very much in the recovery. You'll remember that we are still moving towards, actually, I guess, as some people have said, going to some of the numbers we've seen post. Remember, we lost some 2 million jobs before COVID, and many of those had not been recovered. So it is still very much a stepwise approach to try and return some of those jobs. We know, for example, in the transport sector, a lot of people are starting to go back to work. People are starting to go back to their businesses. So you will see a slight uptick. I guess it's, in some ways, people will say it's surprising, but not everybody is going to be working from home. So the transport sector is starting to grow because people are actually sort of, engaging again in those activities. We've seen certainly, for example, the transportation very much of things like coal and commodities. So there is a sense there that there is some growth that we would have seen in transport as we return, and some of the key surges that we've seen. It's certainly true of trade, that you would see a little bit more trade that is starting to recover somewhat as people, as the economy starts to take up again. But it's really far from what we need. I mean, I think you read the big number there of 15 million people who are still out of work, and that's a huge number that still very much needs a dent.
Do you believe that the data had been difficult to interpret in recent quarters due to some of the technical factors related to data collection?
Certainly, I think that during COVID, remember that first lockdown really harmed the ability to analyze these numbers, because remember that there was this disjoint between the unemployment number and the number of people who are in work. Remember, the unemployment rate really does take out people who are actually not looking for work. So if you're not looking and you haven't been looking for a quarter, we don't count you as unemployed. And of course, many people were not looking during the lockdown for obvious reasons. And so some of those people then were taken out, and that looked like the unemployment number was better. So some of that has been a problem. Obviously, of course, the data collection itself over COVID has been difficult because we've had to try and find different kinds of sources to verify it, and many people could not actually go and knocking on doors because we were on lockdown. So there has been a lot of problems with the data collection and the distortion. But I guess over time, we'll actually, the statisticians will have to work much harder to try and sort of and sift through the numbers so that we actually start to get a better picture. But you are quite right, there has been some difficulties reading the numbers.
Before I let you go, there's been a very interesting debate in terms of where do we pour more resources? Is it more in social grants or is it in public employment schemes to be able to alleviate a little bit of that pressure? Where do you stand on that?
Well, I mean, it's a number of things that we've got to do. And sometimes one of the things that we do is to assume silver bullets. Let me say, for example, some of the biggest losses that we've seen are in households. That tells us something about the pressure households are facing. You know, that would be, for example, people who work as gardeners, people who work as painters, people who may even work as domestic workers. Those people continue to lose jobs by such large numbers. I think the number this time around is around 45,000. That's a lot of people. Those are also the relatively unskilled and vulnerable people. So you see that requires a particular kind of that maybe also indicate some pressure that people have on issues of prices, so inflation, the interest rates that people are facing, so basically trying to cut down wherever they can. That's a particular kind of intervention because obviously we know that kind of vulnerability. Where we think about, for example, when people have said, let's increase social grants, they imagine that when you increase the social grants, people will be able, for example, to buy local produce. So you take that money, you say you go and buy local produce. But we also know we don't produce that very much of the staples. Much of our rice is imported, much of our wheat is imported.
Right.
What we produce very well is maize. So oil, of course. So the big staples that apply to people who earn social grants are not produced in South Africa, they're imported. So that money is likely to be externalized. So it will not really necessarily create jobs here at home.
Right.
But it can obviously provide that cushion so that people don't go hungry because they're unemployed. So I think it is important to say what it is that we are trying to do. I think social grants are very important to keep people from stealing. They may be very important for the local economy where things are value added for manufacturing.
Xhanti?
Basic jobs won't be so well.
I would have loved to, continue this conversation because there's so much to unpack also from there and some of the solutions that we should be considering. However, unfortunately, we have run out of time, but that is Xhanti Payi, who is an economist at Nascence Advisory, unpacking the recent employment figures.